Thank you so much, Michael, for the introductions. Good afternoon, everybody. Paul and I will be speaking about our exhibition we co-curated entitled Crafting Worldviews. And just to give you a little bit of contextualization as to how I personally came to work on this exhibit, I'm a curator of European art with an expertise in 16th and 17th century Dutch and Flemish art, as well as in the visual culture of global exchange from the 16th to the early 19th century. And my work as a curator and scholar is informed by my personal background as a person of color and by my scholarly approach, which is to restore historically underrepresented narratives. And I arrived at Yale shortly after the pandemic began, which is April 2020 in my personally, and I was offered an opportunity to revive an exhibition project on art and science in early modern Europe. While the science component of this exhibition was really a new territory for me as an art historian, I found the project to be not just a great challenge to expand my scholarly horizon by working with Paola, but also an opportunity to present a topic that had not been addressed in art museums.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Michael, for the wonderful introduction, and thank you to everyone for being with us. I am the curator. I have the great pleasure of serving as the curator of the History of Science and Technology division of the Peabody Museum, which stewards a collection of scientific instruments from antiquity to the present. I'm fortunate to partner with Alexi Baker, who is the collection manager of the division. And I've tried since I arrived here at Yale 15 years ago to bring this collection to the broader public. I was very lucky to be able to work with Jessie and UAG on this exhibition that showcases for the first time a good amount of this collection, which is really only the tip of the iceberg, what you can see in Crafting Worldviews. I am a scholar of early modern science, medicine, and technology, mostly in Europe. Early modern for me means above all the 17th and the 18th century. I'm interested, much like Jessie, in marginalized figures and in practices more than theories and the big names of science. I'm very interested in how scientific knowledge gets to be what it is and the question of why we believe what we believe. And in my teaching, I have focused on the history of collecting, mostly in Europe, in the time period that the exhibition covers. I've taught on science, natural history, experimental philosophy in the age of the scientific revolution. And in my teaching, I've been able to use collections at Yale, the Yale collections. And so I was able to see what Yale has, most often in storage rather than on display. And with the students, I've been incredibly excited and thrilled to find so many objects, many of which are now on display. So the collaboration with Jessie was really wonderful because it gave me and the division, the Peabody division, an opportunity to present scientific instruments in a new way. And so we will discuss this, Jess and I, how we envision this exhibition, trying to really break new grounds in the context of museum display.
Yeah, so with that, collaboration really was central to the exhibition. In terms of building a curatorial team, Paul and I brought in Alexi Baker, whom Paula just mentioned, as a collaborator. And for those who are in the audience who may not know Alexi, not only does she oversees the collection of scientific instruments at the Peabody, she's also an expert on 18th century British makers of scientific instruments. And two graduate curatorial interns and one undergraduate student in the European Art Department here at the Art Gallery also worked on this show during different stages of the project. And Paola and I also convened an advisory committee for this exhibition, whose names appear in this slide. And they really generously offered their insight on the themes of this exhibition and on the labels during the writing process. We also had the great benefit of additional staff members from the art gallery who reviewed and offered feedback on the labels. As for the objects themselves, about nearly 100 works are presented in this show. And the Peabody's holdings of scientific instruments really constitute about 60% of the object checklist showcase in this exhibition. And the remaining 40% comprises works from the art gallery, the Beinecke, the Medical Historical Library, the Lewis Walpole Library, and the Yale Center for British Art, as Michael mentioned earlier. For me as an art historian who works across media, which is basically from paintings to sculpture, deck arts to works on paper, I very much enjoy the process of visiting, of course, with COVID-related restrictions in place, and going through collections across campus with Paola and discussing them together. And so we selected a wide range of works that would not only best articulate the themes of the exhibition, but also demonstrate the remarkable quality and depth of the numerous collections across campus. So the objects range from the usual, such as books, maps, globes, drafting tools, telescopes, microscopes, and sundials, to the more unfamiliar, especially to the modern day audience, such as a hand-cranked model of the solar system, air pumps, automaton clock, trade cards, peep shows, and anatomical figures carved in ivory.
So before we discuss these beautiful objects that you see, I wanted to give you a sense of what the exhibition is about. And the best way for doing that is to start with the title, Crafting Worldviews, Science and Art in Europe, 1500, 1800. What we try to do is to show how objects of art and objects of science contributed to shaping worldviews in Europe. And these worldviews had to do with the position of Europe and Europeans with respect to the rest of the world and other humans on the world. And so conceptions of European superiority in particular. And also how these objects of art and science normalized horrific practices such as slavery and the slave trade and colonialism. So this is really what the exhibition is doing. It presents scientific instruments and objects of art, not just for what they are, and we, especially Jessie's expertise, helped in really choosing the most striking, visually striking objects. But there is an exhibition for the eye, for sure, but really what we wanted to do is something you find in the content, in the labels, and how we paired objects or juxtaposed objects. Has to do with this really a challenging history of European colonialism, and in particular the slave trade, the enormous wealth that arrived into Europe as a result of these practices, and the contribution of science to colonialism, and also the benefit that European philosophers, early scientists, we could say, had as a result of these practices. So the objects are really presented to visitors in the context of this new way of looking at them. And I really emphasize the novelty of this approach, because when it comes to historical scientific instruments, often when they are presented in museums, they are presented as relics associated to some important scientists of the past, or they are presented as evidence of scientific progress, especially when some early object is presented together with a more modern looking one. We distanced ourselves from this kind of narratives. We are not so much interested in individuals. We are not so much interested in specific scientific disciplines. We are interested instead in how science and art combined to shape worldviews in Europe. And so we were particularly lucky because we could use the wealth of Yale collections for these purposes. And so we would like to give you a tour of this exhibition by emphasizing how the pairing of objects of different media enabled us to convey this kind of message. And so to give you a flavor of that, you see here on the right a photograph of the first group of instruments that visitors encounter in the exhibition. And as you see, these are a number of navigational and surveying instruments. And to the left, there is a group of a set of playing cards from Beinecke, actually from the library that is hosting this talk. And how do this combination help us show how scientific instruments normalize colonialism? On the right, so you have this set of navigational and surveying instrument, and of course there is no open ocean navigation without these kind of instruments. Above all, there is no surveying of land without surveying instruments. And we know that these practices are really intertwined with land dispossession, for example, in the Americas, colonization, European colonization in the rest of the world as well. These on the left, these seemingly innocent looking set of playing cards actually offer quite a different take on this instrument. The playing cards are exactly what they are. So it's something that enables game, playing, families playing together, different generations coming around a table to play with cards. But they also represent, each one of them represents a mathematical instrument. This set was made by a maker of mathematical instruments in the early 18th century called Thomas Tuttle, working in London. And each card represents in the upper portion, one kind of instrument or its application. And the caption actually explains the kind of application, the kind of instrument and its use. And if we can see a detail, so you have a better sense here with these three cards, Tuttle is conveying the message to the users of this card that mathematics is a useful science for a variety of reasons, including finding a job and being polite in conversation, displaying learning in conversation, but also to find mining, as you see in the second card, for navigation, for war, for surveying new land. So there is really this sense in Britain in this case, but in other European empires as well, that scientific instruments and science in general is useful for a variety of purposes, including those that we foreground in this exhibition, which is the conquest of new lands and the trading in humans that the horrible crime against humanity of slavery was. I just wanted to add that this is exactly my approach as a scholar. Visual and material sources often tell us different stories than what we find in texts. Texts often, even from the time period we are studying, produced by makers, artisans, or the scientists themselves, give us a lot of information, of course, but often they make invisible, they erase other figures that, for the purposes of this exhibition, we tried to foreground. So on the one hand, this exhibition shows how science both benefited colonialism. On the other hand, the exhibition brings to the forefront voices and historical figures that have been erased in mainstream narratives. And so we are thinking in particular of indigenous communities and groups, as well as the enslaved, especially enslaved Africans.
So, with that, we will introduce the exhibitions by sections here. So serving as an introduction is a section entitled Voyages of Conquest, which presents colonialism's profound impact on art and science. In this section, as Paula mentioned earlier, really makes explicit the vision of conquest that drove European empires' travel around the globe. So such as navigation and surveying instruments, which you saw just a few moments ago, as well as boxes of specimens used for daily use, and a selection of medals issued by governments and trading companies, articulate how conquest of lands and the often violent encounters with indigenous peoples in Asia, Africa, and the Americas established paths for new knowledge, materials, goods, and skills to enter Europe, as well as narrate claims of territorial and economic expansion. So some of the examples we want to show to the audience are these here. So this section includes objects like the one on the left, which is a set of 24 microscope slides made in early 19th century Amsterdam, to address the activities of experts in natural history and the implications of their study of nature. So as seen in this example, specimens gathered from all over the globe have been painstakingly arranged in circular ivory mounts, which were housed in mahogany slipcases to be sold as a luxury collectible item for elite patrons. The dark side of reality, however, is that these specimens, which were given great care for preservation while voyaging across seas, were often aboard slave ships, where enslaved peoples were suffering from inhumane conditions on those very same vessels. And this practice was spurred on by the activities of naturalists who journeyed across seas and learned about the potential medicinal and commercial benefits of these specimens with the assistance of local indigenous and enslaved peoples. So on a related topic, we also show here on the right a journal written by a French slave trader named Robert Durand, who was aboard a slave ship called Le Diligent. And this journal recounts a transatlantic voyage that began in May 1731 and concluded in September 1732. And there are sketches by Durand himself, which included in the journal, and the sketches depict European slave trading ports in the colonies of West Africa and the Caribbean. There were about 256 African women, men, and children who were purchased by the French merchants on this ship. And those who survived the Middle Passage were sold into slavery in Martinique in exchange for sugar, cotton, and the paste of roku tree native to the island. So these stories of violence and extraction, as well as contributions of colonized and enslaved peoples to art and science in Europe, really set the tone of this exhibition. So I'll turn it over to Paola to talk about the next section.
Yes, so the next section of the exhibition takes visitors to the places from which scientific instruments emerged, which is with the workshops of the artisans who made scientific instruments. We call them instrument makers. We call this section workshops of power to emphasize the relevance of these instruments for the purposes of European colonialism and imperialism. So this section, though, illuminates several features of instrument making and the historical figure of the instrument maker. We may think that they were sort of modest or quotidian artisans, but they were not, especially the British makers. They were often members of scientific academies like the Royal Society. They were collaborators with the most important natural philosophers, early scientists of the time. They had such a high social status as to commission portraits of themselves of the kind you see here that represented them as gentlemen. They appear well dressed. They are wearing wigs. On the left, you cannot really see, but we have a maker with a tricorn and gloves inside. They also often sign the instruments that their workshops produce. You can think of these as an early form of branding. And this is a kind of luxury brand. When you purchased in the early modern period an instrument that was signed by the maker, it would be a statement that you made about your own technical expertise. Imagine an architect going around with mathematical instruments signed by the best makers of the time. It's like somebody using the most advanced camera today you can imagine if they are a photographer. Or similar things. We have, for example, a beautiful sundial that is signed, and we'll see it soon. On the left, you see, is signed by a maker called Michael Butterfield, who was very popular in his time, to the point that his objects were often counterfeited. And you can imagine, you can think of this as the equivalent of a Rolex today. Yet this practice of signing the instrument was also an act of erasure of the historical reality of workshop life. Workshops were places with people, not just one individual maker or artisan or artist for that matter. There were lots of people working. Often workshops were physically in the home and where the people lived. And in the home, there were women, mothers, sisters, daughters, as well as children and servants. And they all collaborated in the practice that made the home, the work of the place. And so to the right, for example, and this is how the pairing of different media really helped us show and talk about things that may be invisible in individual objects. So the frontispiece from a book on the chemistry of smell and sense shows exactly this kind of domestic scene that takes place, yes, in the home, but it has to do with the experimental artisanal practice of making and investigating perfumes, scents. And so you see a woman on the left. She may be the wife or the mother of the main chemist here, as well as a child who may be the son or a servant. And this is just one instance through which we can see how the collective nature and the collaborative nature of workshops in the time period. So the signature that the maker, that we see on some instruments, on many instruments at the time, actually indicates who was the person who often just owned the workshop and had the reputation that made these objects even more important. And so this individual authorship was important at the time, but was also something that may make invisible the other historical figures that had just as much importance as the individual maker.
Yeah, so with that, before we move on to the rest of the exhibition, I would like to point out that the first two sections we just discussed, which is Voyages of Conquest and Works of Power, are presented in this particular sequence to lay the groundwork for the four remaining sections of the exhibition. So we're going to talk about those sections, and they have been intentionally laid out in a non-linear manner. So it's a way for us to invite visitors to explore in no particular order the visual and material culture of European science. And because we're doing an online event here talking about the exhibition, there is some kind of sequence to this presentation, but especially from this point onwards, there really isn't one in the actual exhibition galleries. So one of the four remaining sections is called Clockwork Cosmologies, which features an array of objects, as you see here in this gallery shot, that were constructed with gear mechanisms to predict and illustrate the workings of the universe. And so at the center of this section, visitors will encounter an automaton clock in the form of the goddess of hunt, Diana, which I'll be talking about in just a second, an astrolabe, and an orrery. And these objects are surrounded by books, pocket watches, and a painting to articulate the ways in which gear mechanisms impacted the life of the everyday in Europe and in colonies and shaped Eurocentric worldviews. So here on the left is an early 17th century object. As I mentioned earlier, the automaton clock in the form of Diana on her chariot, which self-operates when activated. It houses two sets of gear mechanisms, one inside her throne and the other inside the dark wooden part of the chariot, which is made of ebony, a type of wood that was usually acquired through enslaved labor in various territories of Africa, Asia, and later the Caribbean. And there are also global dimensions further that can be seen in the two African panthers purporting to pull the chariot forward. So such elaborate and complex object like this would have been commissioned, gifted for diplomatic purposes, or shown in a more intimate settings, such as a banquet for kings and nobility, or included in a princely collection, typically called a cabinet of curiosities, which is basically a collection of natural specimens, human-made objects, scientific instruments, and goods from really all over the world. So here, example would have conveyed a warning message against the pursuit of earthly pleasures in this culture of colonial expansion. So there are two really small miniaturized obelisks here in this example, which are symbols of power in Europe since ancient Rome's conquest of Egypt. And there is also a monkey being seated and eating an apple. And the monkey, as well as the obelisks, are situated near Diana's throne, which houses a spring-driven set of gears guiding the hands of the two clock dials on either side of the throne itself. So together, these elements reference worldly desires ending with the passage of time. And this object is from the art gallery and is presented with other types of objects to address gear mechanisms, such as the one on the right and the slide here, which is a map published by Willem Blau, and it's a publication on loan from the YCDA. And this is the whole book itself is a compilation of maps of many regions around the world. And this particular page opening we selected for this exhibition shows a map of a northeastern region of present-day Brazil, then a site of Dutch colony of Pernambuco. On the upper part of the map, we see a vignette of a sugar plantation. And this view includes a sugar mill that is equipped with this massive rotating gears and cylinders, appearing to operate with limited human labor as it presses sugar canes. It presents enslaved individuals inserting canes between the cylinders, while another person carries off the juiced crop to be refined further by boiling. This image, however, is really a sanitized depiction of sugar production in the Dutch colony. In reality, many enslaved Africans became permanently disabled from having their limbs caught between the cylinders of the mill, or even die from the exhaustive work of boiling pressed sugar. So through this example, we show how clockwork mechanisms provided a template for machines, which were widely celebrated as masterpieces of ingenuity, but in reality, really concealed the exploitation that such machines enabled in European colonies.
Okay, so this is another section called Consuming Science that shows how science entered the education of the European elites and how it contributed to shaping these notions of European superiority. So we have here a variety of scientific instruments that were used for teaching, in particular teaching about the experimental sciences. You have electricity, you have pneumatics, which is the study of the effect of pressure, what was called the spring of the air, on a variety of things, including pumps and fountains. We have several microscopes and optical instruments, as well as the playing cards that I discussed earlier. And here again, the bringing together different media enhanced the message of this section. There is also an emphasis here on material. Mahogany, for example, is a tree that is native to the Caribbean and was felled. The trees were felled in large numbers to make room for sugar plantations, and enslaved Africans were forced to fell the trees that then arrived in Britain, where furniture makers used the new wood to craft fashionable furniture. Instrument makers subcontracted the wooden parts of the most elaborate machines to furniture makers or cabinet makers, and so mahogany entered the world of instrument making. And this is another way in which colonialism, slavery get normalized in Europe among the European elites in this time period. If we can have the next slide, you will see another pairing of media. You have a scientific object to the left, a pocket globe is called, which is a small, it's a 3-inch in diameter terrestrial globe encased by a representation of the constellations that can be seen around the Earth. And of course, there is no celestial globe as such, but it was something that was often made and consumed in Europe. And so what is interesting about the object on the left is that it is at the same time a scientific and an artistic object. It represents geographical knowledge of the time, astronomical knowledge of the time, but of course the making requires a lot of technical skills. In addition, we have some information represented on the globe that are important, relevant to notions of Britishness at the time. We have on the terrestrial globe engraved the trajectory of James Cook's third voyage, and George Hansen's voyage around the world, and also the celestial globe. So the one of the two hemispheres, the one in particular representing the southern constellations, named by Dutch cartographers the Indian. And so there is this very stereotyped representation of an indigenous person to identify the constellation of the Indian. So we can imagine elites like the ones represented to the right. You have a scene in which a lady is learning about astronomy and geography with a male tutor in a very aristocratic context, as we see. So we can imagine this kind of users for the globe really absorbing conceptions of European superiority as they enjoy these scientific and artistic objects.
So on that note, this section called World Seen and Unseen really addresses depictions of the natural and human worlds of different regions in Africa, Asia, and the Americas most Europeans actually had never seen. So in some cases, objects that depict these regions entirely reimagined their subjects, juxtaposing the strange to the familiar, the undeveloped to the cultivated, the monstrous to the normal, the barren to the bountiful. And so they emphasized and categorized human difference while reinforcing stereotypes about peoples from geographic areas beyond Europe. So such as the example on the left, the Pleasant Gallery of the World, which fabricated the world beyond Europe through repurposed or copied illustrations from earlier publications. And this entire compilation comprises 66 tomes purportedly showing the entire world, and it's a truly ambitious output of a Dutch publisher named Peter van der Aa. The books represented the various lands, peoples, and customs of Africa, Asia, and the Americas in a highly stereotypical manner. And here we are seeing a page opening of one of the Africa volumes showing 4 views of the Kingdom of Congo, located in present-day Angola. Appearing at the top left in particular is a baptism held at the Christian Church of Congo, where the Congolese priests and devotees have been whitewashed to appear indistinguishable from Europeans. The image at top right shows enslaved individuals carrying noblemen of Congo in litters, which is a motif to signal their difference from elites in Europe, who typically traveled on horseback or in carriages. And the bottom images portray imagined creatures such as a zebra, alongside stereotyped figures representing Africans with feathered hats. So together, the 4 pictures present the Kingdom of Congo as dominated by and assimilated into European culture on the one hand, and as uncivilized and strange on the other. And on the right is an example of a peep show from the Beinecke Library. And peep shows are really miniature sets of prints inserted into a wooden or cardboard box and glimpsed through a peephole to create an immersive experience for the viewers. And this particular example is published by the workshop of Martin Engelbrecht in Augsburg, Germany. And it depicts sugar plantation in the Caribbean, likely on Saint-Domingue. And the enslaved African women and men here are shown carrying wood to cutting canes, sugar canes, to working at the extremely dangerous sugar mill, to speaking to a slaveholder. And they are toiling under the supervision of European overseers, whose beating rods are persistently at the ready to threaten and terrorize them. And this peep show consists of 5 hand-colored engravings that are based on images of slavery that circulated widely in Europe and turned the reality of violence and exploitation into a form of visual entertainment. So with that, Paola will talk about the last section of this exhibition.
Yes, this is called Bodies of Nature, and it addresses anatomy and microscopy and natural history in particular. And you see here in this case dedicated to microscopy, a variety of microscopes on the right, and then on the left, one of the most important books in the early history of microscopy, which is Robert Hooke's, the British naturalist and microscopist and instrument maker Robert Hooke's micrographia, or description of the smallest, the minutest creatures. And what you see on the right, the opening, is on this folded plate that is quite large, that represents a flea. And of course, the discovery that smallest creature like a flea were so elaborate, so complex, when seen through the microscope, generated a number of new ideas and visions about the world and the notion of order. This section emphasizes early modern science, one aspect in particular of early modern science, which is the hunt for the secrets of nature. This idea that nature was full of secrets to discover and that nature kept them hidden. And so these secrets could be found through instruments like the microscope, or in the interior of the human body, or in lands that Europeans had become acquainted with very recently, as in the Americas. And so in the next slide, we see the frontispiece of a very important, consequential work of natural history. This book was read well into the 19th century, so it was first published in 1648. And its frontispiece is quite striking. You see, it's a visual quotation from the Garden of Eden. So it's a rendering of the Garden of Eden that features local people and fauna, and the place is presented as a tropical paradise ripe for the Europeans' possession. And so there, as you see, there's a lot of stereotyping as typical in European illustrations of non-European places of the time. What is interesting, though, about this work in particular is that it does contain a lot of information about local indigenous communities and groups that these days, actually, indigenous communities in Brazil cover knowledge about the local communities. So I will stop there for this section.
Yeah, so as we wrap up our presentation, we sincerely thank so many of our colleagues across campus who, in spite of really numerous challenges we faced over the last years due to the pandemic, went above and beyond to make the Crafting Worldviews exhibition possible. And Paola, do you want to say a few words?
Yes, I would like to acknowledge the work of the wonderful staff at UAG who worked with us behind the scene well before the exhibition was open to the public over a number of years. I also want to say that as an academic, as a scholar who's used to writing papers and books, the practice of writing and rewriting labels with Jessie has taught me a lot. And I just want to say that it's a very important process that takes just as much work and thinking as a scholarly article. And more academics should be aware of this important work that takes place in museums. Museums are public-facing institutions, and so the message that museums send reaches larger numbers, and is very important to work together. This exhibition, producing this exhibition, putting together this exhibition has taught me a lot about the importance of museum work, and also the amount of thoughtfulness that writing sensitive and deep, insightful labels requires.
Yeah, so we hope all of you have a chance to visit the gallery before the show closes on June 25th, and really see what the deep holdings of various collections at the university have to offer, and the kinds of important conversations that can be generated from them. So with that, thank you all very much for your attention.
Thank you both, Jessie and Paola. I would co-sign a comment in the chat that this is a brilliant presentation with essential information for all. In our moments together before we conclude at 5, I wanted to pose to you a question, Jessie, that sort of comes off of what Paola was saying, how she learned working in a museum setting. I wonder if you could talk from your perspective as a museum curator, what some of the takeaways of learning for your own practices in this collaboration with a scientific scholar, and working a little bit outside of your traditional comfort zone, perhaps.
Yeah, so thank you for that question, Michael, and I think that's a really great one. And so for me, I personally think about curatorial practice as something that is not simply a projection of what I know as a scholar, but really thinking about it through the lens of the visitors. Do they feel comfortable in this space? What are the impressions? What are the tidbits of knowledge do they gain from experience and exhibition? And so from that perspective, I think about the placement of objects, where things are hung, and thinking about sort of their museum experience as embodied experience. And so when it comes to working with scientific instruments, which were, obviously very different kinds of objects than I'm used to seeing and researching. And so talking about actually learning about these objects from Paola, who have taught with these objects for a very long time, it was really helpful for me to kind of think about where her knowledge of the instruments intersect with my curatorial practice as a museum curator, and kind of thinking about how that could potentially inform the ways in which our visitors can experience the exhibition. So that can come in multiple ways, where there's definitely at least one case in which we have 2 books that are typically would have been placed side by side as a way of comparison, but we actually turned one of the books by 90 degrees to make sure that the message coming from those 2 books should not be compared, for example. And we were also very particular about the height of the section text, as well as the paintings of, especially the portraits of the artisans, to kind of really think about how those kind of ways of display could send another kind of message to the visitors that there's nothing to really celebrate here when it comes to European notions of superiority, but let's really have a more critical but necessary conversations about European colonialism through this exhibition.
Thank you so much. Paul, I wonder if you might give us, even if it's a little teaser, when the Peabody Museum reopens in 2024, some of what people might see coming out of the Division of Science and Technology, what will be new and different, and maybe prepare us with questions that we might have in mind as we all eagerly await the Peabody Museum reopening, and also all very excited that it will be every day free and open to all. But I wonder if you could give us a little preview.
Yes, thank you for mentioning this. Yes, among the many novelties in the renovated Peabody, there will be the first ever Yale History of Science and Technology gallery. So I'm very excited that we are working on this. that is a different creature with respect to this one. Here, we could use materials from various collections, whereas what you will see in we call it the HST, History, Science and Technology Gallery, will be a selection of scientific instruments and various other technologies, all from one collection, which is the History, Science and Technology collection of the Peabody Museum. I don't want to reveal too much, except that the focus is there will be many more instruments. Is about 100 objects on display, and the process of writing labels is completely different there. It will be much shorter, and there will be probably apps with additional context. And I will stop here just to make you curious.
It's terrific. Want to again encourage everybody to make their way to Chapel Street if you can, to the art gallery, open Tuesdays to Sundays, always free and open to all. And I would end by noting, as many in this Zoom are aware, last week, as I mentioned at the beginning, marked the launch of Lux, a new Yale Collections Discovery platform. I put a link in the chat for those who haven't seen it yet. Encourage you to get to know it. And as I said, I really think that this is an extraordinary time on campus, more collaboration than ever. And your exhibition really is a catalyst, I think, for all of us to see in real time how 1 + 1 + 1 can equal almost infinity. And I wanted to just close by giving each of you an opportunity to muse and what your own aspirations and hopes for the future of such collaborations across campus and where it might take us in the next 5, 10, 20 years, but it's sort of based on what you've proven and seen in this, where you hope collaboration across the cultural heritage collections might take us in the future. So whatever thoughts each of you have to close this out.
Yeah, so I'm happy to briefly remark on that topic. So this, thanks to this project, I was able to really think further about my future exhibition projects here at Yale. And I think with the launch of Lux platform, I'm really looking forward to kind of really realizing those exhibition projects with these extraordinary collections we have across campus. And so I think the kind of level of discoverability and searchability that we could really take advantage of through Lux is what I'm really looking forward to inform my future projects going forward.
And very, very briefly, I'll say that I hope, especially when the HST gallery opens, that there will be a lot of community engagement. I hope that even though we cannot bring into the gallery objects from other collections, the gallery will be an opportunity to spark discussions and activities with people who are well beyond Yale.
As both perfect notes for us to close on. Comments in the chat include thanking you for fresh, illuminating, fascinating, brilliant. So my thanks to both of you. The thanks from our 80+ people who've joined us live today. And again, encourage everybody to make sure to go see this show before it closes on June 25th. Jessie, Paola, thanks so much for the exhibition and especially for taking the time this afternoon to share your work with us all. Have a great afternoon, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.